When I was a kid, my dad used to tell me this story about a creature that lived in the forest near our house. Not the tooth fairy, mind you, that was a lie told to kids who still had an innocent outlook on life. No, the thing my dad warned me about was something much worse. He called it the tooth collector. My dad had a strange way of explaining things, always leaning in too close with wide eyes, like he was sharing the world's most forbidden secret. He'd sit me down and say, "You see, Danny, the tooth collector doesn't care if you've lost your tooth the right way, by falling out naturally or being yanked. It only cares that it gets what it's owed." I used to laugh at him, thinking it was just one of his weird stories, but he never cracked a smile, never showed a hint that he was joking. And then he'd lower his voice and add, "Don't leave them out too long. It'll come." Years went by, and as you can imagine, I outgrew my belief in his nonsense. I was 14 by the time something happened that made me rethink everything. My little sister Emily lost her first tooth. She was 8 at the time and excited about the tooth fairy. She placed the tiny, bloody thing under her pillow with wide-eyed wonder. I remember feeling a strange unease, but I chalked it up to growing out of the magic. I didn't say anything. Why ruin her fun? That night, something woke me up. It was around 3 a.m., the witching hour, as people like to say. I heard something, a scratching noise, like nails dragging across wood. At first, I thought it was coming from my window, so I ignored it, assuming it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind. But then I realized it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then came the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. They were heading down the hallway, toward Emily's room. I was scared, but my older brother instincts kicked in. I slipped out of bed, as quiet as I could, and opened my bedroom door just a crack. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of Emily's night light. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was my dad, crouched by Emily's bed. But something was off. The figure was too thin, too tall. Its limbs were wrong, unnaturally long, like a puppet on strings. Its back was hunched, and I could see a glint of light off something in its hand. I squinted, trying to make sense of the scene, but when it turned its head slightly, I felt my stomach drop. The thing was wearing a mask, a grinning, grotesque thing that looked like it was made from human teeth. Thousands of tiny teeth, all arranged to form a sickening, jagged smile. I froze, barely breathing. The thing reached out toward Emily, its bony fingers brushing against her pillow. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but fear held me in place, paralyzed. I could only watch as it carefully lifted her pillow and retrieved the tooth she had left there. Its fingers lingered for a moment, brushing her hair softly before it slunk back into the shadows, its footsteps fading into nothing. The next morning, Emily was thrilled to find money under her pillow, none the wiser. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake what I had seen. I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, but I knew better. I could still hear the soft drag of its footsteps in the back of my mind. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? It sounded insane. But things didn't stop there. A few weeks later, Emily lost another tooth. And again, I heard the same scratching, the same footsteps in the middle of the night. This time I was ready. I stayed awake, sitting at the edge of my bed, listening. The scratching started again, faint at first but growing louder. I crept to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, there it was, the same creature crouched by her bed. I knew I should have turned away, closed the door, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what it was doing. It didn't just take her tooth this time. As it lifted the tiny piece of bone from under her pillow, it paused. Then, with a grotesque tenderness, it leaned over her, opening its mouth wide. And what I saw, I'll never forget. Its mouth was filled with teeth, not human ones. These were sharp, jagged, and all different shapes and sizes, crammed together in a horrifying display. It bit down, hard, on Emily's discarded tooth, chewing slowly, almost savoring it. My stomach churned. I slammed the door shut, unable to take it any longer. The noise must have startled it because, for the first time, the thing turned toward me. Its mask of teeth seemed to grin even wider. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, Emily was fine. No sign of the creature, but I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back. It wasn't just collecting teeth. It was feeding. The days turned into weeks, and the thing didn't return. I wanted to believe it was over, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then, Emily started to change. She became distant, quieter. Her bright, bubbly personality faded, replaced by something cold. She stopped laughing, stopped playing with her toys, and spent most of her time staring out the window, her fingers brushing against her lips as if something was missing. Then one night, she came into my room. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. She didn't say anything, just stood there, holding something out to me. It was one of her teeth, a molar freshly pulled from her mouth. Blood dripped from her gums, staining her chin. She whispered, "It wants more." I stared at her, my mind racing. My little sister stood there, blood trickling from her mouth, holding out a tooth like an offering. Her words echoed in my ears. Asterisk. It wants more. Asterisk. I grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her lightly. "What are you talking about, Emily? Who wants more?" But she just blinked at me, her eyes distant, hollow. "He comes when I sleep," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's hungry, Danny. He's always hungry." A shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the memory of that thing, crouched by her bed, chewing on her tooth like it was some kind of delicacy. I knew exactly who she meant, but I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. I didn't want to believe it. Couldn't. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up," I muttered, trying to pull her toward the bathroom. But she resisted, digging her heels into the floor. "I don't want to sleep, Danny," she said, her voice trembling. "He'll come back, and this time, he'll take more than just a tooth." My heart pounded in my chest as I guided her into the bathroom, turning on the light. Her reflection in the mirror was almost unrecognizable, pale, gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. And then there was her mouth. It was worse than I thought. 2 of her front teeth were missing, not just one, and the gaps were jagged, bloody. How did this happen?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you pull them out yourself?" Emily looked down at the sink, her fingers gripping the edges of the counter. She didn't answer right away, but when she finally spoke, her words sent a chill through me. "I didn't pull them out," she said quietly. "He did. He comes when I'm asleep and takes them. But it's not enough. It's never enough." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Emily, we need to tell Mom and Dad. This isn't normal. They need to know what's happening." Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, wide with panic. "No, you can't tell them. He'll get angry if you do. He told me, if you tell anyone, he'll take more than teeth. He'll take everything. I felt sick. Emily wasn't just scared. She was terrified. And worse, she believed every word of it. I didn't know what to do. What could I do? This wasn't something you could just explain away. The tooth collector, or whatever it was, wasn't just a story. It was real. And it was coming for my sister. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let it happen again. I wasn't going to let that thing take another piece of her. So I stayed awake, sitting in the chair next to Emily's bed, my eyes fixed on the door. The house was silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I could hear Emily's breathing, slow and steady, as she slept fitfully. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to wonder if maybe it was over, if maybe whatever curse had befallen us had lifted. But then, just as I began to relax, I heard it. The scratching. It started softly, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere down the hallway. My heart raced, and I clenched my fists, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The scratching grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. And then the handle turned. The door creaked open, and there it was. The same thing I had seen before, standing in the doorway, its twisted skeletal frame casting long shadows across the room. The mask of teeth still grinned at me, its eyes, if it had any, hidden behind the grotesque mask. It didn't move at first, just stood there, as if it was studying me. My stomach churned, and I could feel the bile rising in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let it see my fear. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay strong. It didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if considering my question. Then, slowly, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed at Emily. I stepped in front of her, blocking its path. "You can't have her," I said, my voice firmer this time. "You've taken enough. Leave her alone." For a moment, it didn't move. The air in the room grew colder, and I could feel a strange pressure building, like the walls were closing in on me. And then, with a sudden burst of movement, it lunged forward, faster than I could have anticipated. I barely had time to react. Its long fingers wrapped around my wrist, its grip cold and impossibly strong. Pain shot through my arm as I tried to pull away, but it held me in place, its toothy mask inches from my face. It leaned in close, and for the first time it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp, like the sound of bones grinding together. "More." With that single word, it let go, shoving me aside with surprising force. I crashed into the wall, my head spinning from the impact. Dazed, I struggled to get to my feet, but by the time I looked up, the thing was gone. Emily was still asleep, undisturbed by the chaos. But as I stood there, breathing heavily, I realized something had changed. The window was open, the cold night air blowing the curtains gently. And there, on the windowsill, was a small, bloody tooth. It wasn't Emily's. It was mine. I touched my mouth, feeling the gap where one of my molars had been. The blood was fresh, the wound still raw. The tooth collector had taken its payment. I stood there, feeling the sharp edges of the missing tooth with my tongue. A wave of nausea hit me as the realization sank in. It wasn't just Emily anymore. The tooth collector had come for me too. I swallowed the panic rising in my chest and shut the window. The night air, though cold, wasn't enough to explain the chill that now lived inside me. I checked Emily. She was still asleep, thankfully unharmed for now. But how long could that last? The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't tell Mom or Dad. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and I couldn't risk Emily's warning about angering it. I watched her closely, though. She seemed distant, more so than before, like she was slipping away, piece by piece. There were more gaps in her smile now. More teeth had gone missing. Every morning, she'd say nothing, but I'd notice the red, swollen gums and the way she avoided looking me in the eye. One night, as I sat at my desk, obsessively searching the internet for anything that could explain this nightmare, I came across something strange. It wasn't on any official website or forum. It was buried deep in a string of old, forgotten blog posts and obscure message boards. Someone had posted a story eerily similar to mine, a story about a creature that collected teeth. It had different names across different cultures. The tooth eater, the maw, le collectionneur de dents in French folklore. But the name that stood out the most was the Forgotten King. Supposedly, this thing wasn't just a creature. There was a deeper legend behind it. According to an old European myth, it had once been a powerful entity, a ruler of some forgotten realm, cursed to wander the human world in search of bones, always hungry but never satisfied. Teeth, it seemed, held some special significance to it. The more I read, the worse the stories became. Some claimed the creature could only be appeased by regular offerings. Teeth, bones, anything it could consume. Others said that if it wasn't fed, it would grow more aggressive, taking more than just teeth. It would start with small things, a fingernail, a toe, a limb, until eventually it consumed everything. What chilled me most were the accounts of people disappearing entirely. Their beds left empty, only a few teeth scattered across their rooms. It wasn't just children it took either. Adults, too, were prey, though they seemed to go faster, as if their bones couldn't satisfy its hunger for long. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to us. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of everything settled on my chest. I couldn't protect Emily from this thing. I couldn't even protect myself. The collector was getting bolder, and soon it wouldn't just be about teeth. I was almost asleep when I heard it again. The soft, unmistakable scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from my closet. My breath caught in my throat, and I sat up, staring at the door. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was inside was trying to claw its way out. I knew it was the collector. It was in my room now. I thought about running, about waking my parents, but something stopped me. If I ran, it might go after Emily instead. It wanted more, and I couldn't let it have her. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe. And then the closet door creaked open. I wanted to scream, but the sound lodged in my throat, strangled by fear. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness, just as twisted and wrong as I remembered. The mask of teeth gleamed in the dim light from the hallway, and I could see it more clearly now. The teeth weren't just human. They were from all sorts of creatures, layered and arranged into that grotesque grin. It stepped forward, its movements deliberate, almost predatory. Its hand reached out, those long, bony fingers curling as it pointed at me again. This time I didn't move, couldn't. My entire body was frozen with terror. It stepped closer, so close that I could feel the cold radiating off its body, smell the faint metallic tang of old blood. Then it did something unexpected. It knelt. The collector knelt at the foot of my bed, bowing its head like a servant before a king. Its hand reached up, and it placed something on the floor, something small and white. Another tooth. But this one wasn't mine. It was bigger, older, yellowed with age. I stared at it, my mind reeling, and before I could make sense of what was happening, the creature stood up and turned, walking back into the closet. As it passed through the doorframe, it stopped and spoke once more. More. And then it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I leapt out of bed, my heart pounding, and grabbed the tooth from the floor. It was ancient, far older than anything it had taken from me or Emily. And then it hit me, this wasn't just about us. This thing had been collecting for a long time. Centuries, maybe even longer. But why had it left this one for me? What was the meaning behind it? I spent the next few hours staring at the tooth, trying to understand. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe the collector wasn't just hungry. Maybe it was following some kind of twisted ritual, an endless search for something. But what? My thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Emily. She stood there, clutching her pillow, her eyes wide with fear. "Danny, he's coming for me again. He said tonight is the last time." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" She bit her lip, her voice trembling. "He said, if I don't give him more, he'll take everything. He's not going to stop, Danny. He's never going to stop." I looked down at the tooth in my hand, my mind racing. Maybe there was a way to end this. Maybe if I understood what the collector really wanted, I could stop it before it took everything from us. But time was running out. The scratching had started again. Only this time it was coming from all around the house. The collector wasn't alone. The scratching surrounded us now, faint at first but growing louder by the second, as though the walls themselves were alive with it. Emily clutched my arm, her small hand trembling, and I pulled her into the room, shutting the door behind her. I didn't know what I was protecting us from, but I knew it was closing in. "Stay with me," I whispered, my voice shaky. "Whatever happens, don't open that door." Emily nodded, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. I tried to calm myself down, but my heart felt like it was about to explode from the pressure. And then the scratching stopped. The silence was worse, unnatural, suffocating. I waited for something, anything, but nothing happened. For a moment, it was like the house was holding its breath. I thought maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. Maybe the collector had moved on. Maybe I'd done enough to hold it off. But then came the footsteps. They were soft at first, almost gentle, like someone tiptoeing through the hallway. But as they grew closer, they became heavier, more deliberate. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. The doorknob rattled. Emily gasped and backed away from the door, pressing herself against the wall. I positioned myself between her and the door, feeling utterly helpless. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but there was no plan for something like this. There was only survival, and I wasn't sure we could manage that. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, and then it turned, slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the hallway bathed in the dim glow of the nightlight from down the hall. At first, I didn't see anything. The hallway was empty, just the same as always. But then I heard a shuffling noise, and my blood turned to ice. They were crawling, dozens of them, maybe more, figures, hunched and twisted, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces hidden in shadow. They moved on all fours like animals, their fingers scraping against the floorboards as they crept toward the open door. I stepped back, pulling Emily with me, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what they were, but they were wrong, every inch of them defying the natural order. They weren't human, at least not anymore, and at the front of the pack leading them was him. the tooth collector. Its mask of teeth gleamed in the faint light, and its skeletal frame seemed to glide effortlessly across the floor. The others followed it like loyal pets, their eyes, if they had any, locked on us. I swallowed hard, my voice shaking as I whispered, "What do you want from us? Why are you doing this?" The collector stopped at the threshold, its head tilting as it regarded me. For a moment it didn't move, just stood there watching, and then, slowly, it reached out one of its long, bony hands. In its palm was another tooth, this one larger, older, stained yellow with age. It dropped the tooth on the floor in front of me, and when it spoke, its voice was like dry leaves scraping against stone. More. I stared at the tooth, my mind spinning. I didn't understand. More teeth? More bones? Was that all it wanted? And what about the others, those crawling, twisted things behind it? What were they, and why were they following the collector? Emily whimpered behind me, and I could feel her small body trembling. I had to do something, anything, but I didn't know what. And then, in a sudden burst of clarity, I remembered the tooth it had left me the night before, the one I still had in my pocket. I pulled it out, staring at the ancient thing, and a thought occurred to me. Maybe this was more than just about collecting teeth. Maybe this was about a trade. My heart pounded as I knelt down and picked up the tooth the collector had dropped. Then, holding the two teeth in my hands, I looked back at the creature, hoping I wasn't about to make things worse. "You want more?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What if I give you these?" The collector didn't respond, but its head tilted slightly, as if it were considering my offer. Behind it, the crawling figures shifted restlessly, their nails scraping against the floor. I held out the teeth, my hands shaking. "Take them. Just leave us alone." For a moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel Emily gripping my shirt, holding her breath. And then, slowly, the collector reached out, its long fingers brushing against my palm. It took the teeth, holding them delicately as if they were precious treasures. And then, without a word, it turned and began to retreat, its followers crawling after it. I watched in disbelief as they moved back down the hallway, their forms melting into the shadows until there was nothing left but the faint echo of their footsteps. The door closed softly, and the house fell silent once again. For a long time, I didn't move, couldn't. My body felt like it was made of lead, and my mind struggled to process what had just happened. It felt like a dream, a nightmare, but the bloody gap in my mouth told me it was all too real. Emily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Is it over?" I didn't know how to answer her. Part of me wanted to believe that the trade had worked, that we'd bought our safety for the night. But the other part of me, the part that still remembered the collector's cold, dead eyes, knew it wasn't over. "Not yet. We're safe for now," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Let's try to get some sleep." But sleep didn't come that night. I lay awake, listening to the silence, waiting for the scratching to start again. Because deep down, I knew the truth. The tooth collector would be back. And next time, it would want more than just teeth. The next few days were a blur of tension and exhaustion. I went through the motions of school, meals, and chores, but my mind was elsewhere. I spent every free moment in my room, studying the tooth the collector had left, scouring the internet for answers. Emily barely spoke. She was quieter than ever, her usual playful spirit drained away. She stopped eating much, barely touched her toys, and seemed to spend most of her time just staring out the window, her fingers unconsciously touching her gums, where her teeth had been. I wasn't sleeping either. The shadows in the house felt heavier now, thicker, as if something was always watching, waiting. I knew it wasn't over. The trade had bought us time, but I could feel the weight of something hanging over us, something far worse than the collector's previous visits. The night came, and I was on edge, waiting. The scratching didn't start right away this time, but I knew it would come. It always did. Around midnight, the air in my room grew colder, unnaturally cold. I could see my breath hanging in the air, and then I heard it. The faintest sound, like nails on glass. Not on the walls, not on the floor, but on the windows. I turned, heart pounding, and there it was. Outside my window, in the darkness, I could see a figure pressed against the glass. But it wasn't the collector this time. It was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, like she was in a trance. She stood barefoot in the yard, her nightgown fluttering slightly in the wind. Her hand was resting on the window, her fingers tapping softly against the glass in that rhythmic, scratching way. I shot out of bed, panic surging through me as I raced to the window. I yanked it open, leaning out into the cold night air. "Emily," I hissed, trying not to wake the rest of the house. "What are you doing? Come inside." But she didn't move. She just stared up at me, her expression vacant. It was like she didn't even hear me. I cursed under my breath, pulling on my jacket and shoes before rushing downstairs. My mind raced with possibilities. Was she sleepwalking? Had the collector somehow gotten to her again? I couldn't shake the image of those other figures, the ones that had crawled behind the collector, twisted and deformed. What if this was happening to her? I found her still standing by the window when I made it outside. The cold wind bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. I grabbed her by the shoulders, gently shaking her. "Emily, wake up. Come on." Her eyes flickered, and for a second, I saw a spark of recognition. But then, just as quickly, her face went blank again. Her lips parted, and she whispered something so faint I almost missed it. "He's waiting for you." A chill ran down my spine, and I looked around, half expecting to see the collector lurking in the shadows. But the yard was empty, silent except for the wind rustling the trees. "Who's waiting?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Emily, who?" Her eyes slowly turned to meet mine, and for the first time in days, I saw fear in them. "The others," she whispered. "They're not done. They said you have to go with them." My heart pounded in my chest. "What others? What are you talking about?" She blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and suddenly she was shivering, looking around like she had no idea how she'd gotten outside. "Danny, why am I out here?" she asked, her voice small and scared. I didn't have an answer. I just pulled her close, wrapping my arms around her to keep her warm. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's go inside." We went back into the house, and I locked the door behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The air felt thick, oppressive, and even though Emily was back inside, I knew something had changed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by Emily's bed, watching over her, but she didn't stir. She slept deeply, as if whatever had held her outside had released its grip on her for now. But it didn't release its grip on me. Around 3 a.m., the witching hour, I heard the sound again. This time it wasn't scratching. It was footsteps, not outside but inside the house. Soft, deliberate, like someone walking down the hallway toward my room. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my door. I waited, barely breathing, but nothing happened. No scratching, no rattling doorknob, just silence. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had to. Whatever was out there wasn't going to leave on its own. I turned the knob and slowly pulled the door open. The hallway was dark, the faint glow of Emily's nightlight the only source of light. And standing at the far end of the hall, just at the edge of the shadows, was a figure. It wasn't the collector. It was something else. Something taller, thinner, its body contorted in ways that didn't seem possible. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then it spoke, its voice low and raspy, like whined through dead leaves. "He's not the only one." I froze, my mind racing. The collector wasn't the only one? What did that mean? What was this thing? It took a step forward, and as it did, the air around it seemed to warp, like the shadows were bending toward it. "More," it whispered, echoing the collector's words. "We all need more." My stomach dropped. The collector wasn't alone. There were others, and they were coming for us. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just about teeth anymore. This was something much, much worse. I didn't know what the collector and these others wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to stop until they had everything. I stood there, staring at the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. The shadows outside seemed to be alive, moving, stretching, and whispering. The house felt like it was breathing, groaning under the weight of something ancient, something malevolent. The words echoed in my mind, asterisk, he's not the only one, asterisk. I had no idea what that thing in the hallway was, but I knew it was worse than the collector. It had felt different, darker, like the thing behind the thing. The scratching, the crawling, the collector. It had all been leading up to this moment, like they were heralds for something much bigger, much hungrier. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. Emily was still asleep in her bed, her breath shallow but steady. I glanced at her, then back at the door. I had to get us out of here. We couldn't stay. Whatever was coming for us, it wasn't going to stop until it took everything. My eyes darted to the window. If we could get out quietly, maybe we could make it to the car. Maybe we could just drive, get far enough away before. The doorknob rattled. My blood turned to ice. It was slow at first, like someone gently testing the lock, but then it twisted with a violent shake. Whatever was on the other side wanted in. Now, I grabbed Emily, shaking her gently. "Emily," I whispered urgently, "wake up. We have to go." She stirred but didn't wake. Her skin felt cold, too cold. I shook her harder. "Emily, come on. Wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, but something was wrong. Her pupils were too wide, swallowing up the color of her eyes. She looked through me, not at me as if I wasn't there. And then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "They're already here." Before I could react, the door burst open. But it wasn't just the collector this time. The thing from the hallway was standing in the doorway, its elongated body stretching across the ceiling, its arms impossibly long, fingers dragging on the floor like twisted branches. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was a swirling void, a black emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around it. Behind it, more figures crept into the room. They were crawling, their bodies contorted, twisted like the other things I had seen before. But these were different. They moved with purpose, like they were being called, summoned by something I couldn't understand. And then, standing in the center of them all, was the collector. Its mask of teeth gleamed in the darkness, but this time, its mouth was open wide, revealing row after row of jagged, uneven teeth. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. There was nowhere to run. They were everywhere now, surrounding us, closing in. The collector stepped forward, its head tilting as it regarded me. "More," it rasped, its voice echoing through the room like the sound of bones snapping. "We all need more." The others inched closer, their fingers scraping against the floor, their breath hissing like wind through dead trees. My mind raced. There had to be a way out, something I could do. But as I looked at Emily, still lying there, her eyes wide and vacant, I realized the truth. She wasn't Emily anymore. She was gone, lost to whatever this was. The thing that spoke through her, the thing that watched me with her eyes, it wasn't her. The collector reached out, its long, bony fingers hovering inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating off it, the stench of decay filling the air. And then, in one swift motion, it grabbed my wrist. Pain shot through my arm, sharp and burning, as I felt the bones inside shift, twist unnaturally. I screamed, but the sound barely escaped my throat. The others closed in, their hands reaching for me, their mouths opening in silent hunger. I could feel it now, what they wanted, what they had always wanted. Not just my teeth, not just Emily's. They wanted everything. As the collector's grip tightened, I felt the cold creeping up my arm, spreading through my veins. My skin prickled, my vision blurring as I saw the room tilt, the shadows swirling around me like a vortex. And then I realized I was becoming one of them. I could feel it, their hunger, their need. It was inside me now, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I saw flashes of things, memories that weren't mine, endless nights of searching, of collecting, of taking more and more but never being satisfied. The collector leaned in close, its mask of teeth grinning wider than ever before. Its breath was cold, the scent of rot and earth clinging to it as it whispered in my ear. "You're mine now." I felt my mouth open, but no sound came out. My body was going numb, my mind drifting away. I couldn't fight it anymore. And then I heard Emily's voice, soft, distant, as if from somewhere far away. "Danny, help me." My heart lurched. Emily, asterisk, the real Emily asterisk, was still in there. I had to do something. I couldn't let them take her. I couldn't let them take me. With the last shred of strength I had, I reached into my pocket and grabbed the tooth, the ancient one the collector had left me. I didn't know why, but I felt like it was important, like it was the key to all of this. I held it up, and for the first time, the collector hesitated. Its grip on my wrist loosened, just for a moment, and in that moment, I threw the tooth to the ground. The reaction was immediate. The shadows recoiled, the figures shrieking in unison, their bodies twisting in agony. The collector staggered back, its mouth open in a silent scream, its mask of teeth shattering as it crumbled to the floor. The room seemed to warp, the walls bending, the air vibrating with a high-pitched, deafening hum. The figures, the creatures, the collector, they were all dissolving, turning to dust and ash before my eyes. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. The room was empty, the shadows gone, the air still. I collapsed to the floor, my chest heaving, my body aching all over. Emily stirred beside me. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days, she looked like herself. "Danny?" she whispered, her voice small and scared. I pulled her close, tears streaming down my face. "It's okay," I whispered. "It's over." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The house felt too quiet, too still. The air was too cold. And then I realized the collector was gone, but something had stayed behind. I could feel it now, deep in my bones. The hunger, it was inside me, and it wasn't going away.